I know that we had a very long and tough day, and you must be tired. So I was thinking hard how to do introduction in proper way it would be some kind of entertained. So I start with my autobiography. I don't know for what particular reason, everything that I like is British. My first book was the Winnie the Pooh. And still is my favorite book, and I always quote it as the top 5 book of my life, because it's a very serious book. Then when I grew up, there are 3 other things which I like very much, very British. It's a British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC. It was British Mysteries, and then British rock music, 60s, 70s. Then when I became really adult, I became fan of the British liberalism, because British liberalism is quite unique liberalism, and you quite see it right now in Ukraine, because you don't need to explain to Brits what's at the stake, not like Germans. You have to spend a lot of time to persuade Germans that Ukraine, the help, it is not with Brits, and you know the story of Boris Johnson, who is now probably one of the most famous, favorite Ukrainian leaders. So now we have a very British historian. So this already tells you a lot about quality of this professor. I was thinking how to introduce him, and I believe he doesn't really need introduction. How could I introduce Fred Mercury? Would I say Fred Mercury is a famous British rock star or British composer? It really doesn't matter. In many senses, most part of the world, to say Timoty Ґартона Еша is what he do, because this is something which he really deserves. Last 30 years of my life has been spent with reading Timoty Ґартона Еша, with New York of books. One of my favorite book is Lantern, Magic Lantern. It's a book about 89 revolution, and probably Timoty Ґартона Еша is probably the best author who really conceptualized what really happened in this region. He happened to be here at that time, here, not in Ukraine, but in the central Ukraine. He started to write his dissertation about Eastern Germany under communism. And it was really under communism. It was probably not the best selection, but when he was there, Stasi actually, so to say, followed him. And then after the collapse of communism, he found a file on himself, and he wrote a book about himself, so to say. It's called The File. And the other book, which I was very much impressed, is a book written A Free World. It's been published in the year of the Maidan, 2004. It was very important for us in many senses. And at the same time, he and Timothy Snyder, who is the student, published a very important article about Maidan in New York Review of Books. So, if I may say so, this is what Pani Valeria said in the previous presentation, that the main challenge during the war is to create sense from the nonsense. Because basically what we are doing, we try to create a senses. So if there is a historian of the present who's creating senses of a nonsense, which are threatening us, this is exactly Professor Timoty Ґартона Еша. So without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Timoty Ґартона Еша. Floor is yours. Please welcome Professor Timoty Ґартона Еша.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hrcak. Since you mentioned Boris Johnson, I maybe should start by saying Dobry den, everybody. And I have to say, to be mentioned in the same breath is as Winnie the Pooh. There's no higher honor than that. Let me start by saying very seriously that it's a huge pleasure to be here, and please understand this lecture also as a gesture of solidarity with your really extraordinary struggle for freedom, for independence, for democracy, and a European future, which has earned such tremendous admiration around the world. The other reason I'm very glad to be here is, as Professor Hrcak mentioned, I've been lucky enough to experience some of the great moments, particularly of Central and East European history, starting with the Solidarity movement in Poland in 1980-81, the Velvet Revolutions of 1989, the wars in former Yugoslavia, the fall of Milosevic, the Orange Revolution, which I witnessed at first hand in Kiev, and this is where European history is now being made at this moment. I have no doubt about it. And what I'm going to do this evening is two things. First of all, I'm going to give you a history lecture. And then I thought it might be interesting to say something about the current situation around the war in Ukraine, prospects for the future, to invite a conversation about that. The two things are connected, although separate. So let me start with the history lecture. What I'm going to give you, my title is From Post-War Europe to Post-War Europe and Back. I have to tell you, when I gave this lecture in Göttingen, several people asked me, what do you mean by and back? I think here in Ukraine you have no difficulty understanding the point of the title. And this, what I'm going to give you, is part of the argument of a book of mine which is coming out next year called Homelands of Personal History of Europe. And this book, which looks at the history of Europe since 1945, is in conversation with a book that many of you will know, Tony Judd's Post-War. Hands up, how many people know Tony Judd's Post-War? Quite a few people. So it's a great history of Europe from 1945, actually until the early 2000s. And his title has two meanings, an obvious one and a less obvious. The obvious meaning is after the war, after 1945. The less obvious meaning is post-war, i.e. a Europe which after 1945 set out to be a continent on which there would be no more wars. Right? Its slogan was, never again. Now, this promise was not realized after 1945. The idea that Europeans had abjured and abhorred war would have been news to people in Algeria or Kenya or Malaya or Vietnam or Angola or Mozambique, because the West European colonial powers were actually fighting wars to defend their empires for 30 years. Angola and Mozambique only became independent in the mid-1970s. It would also have been news, as you know, to people in Central and Eastern Europe. Military conflict continued in this part of Europe into the late 1940s. Then you had the Soviet invasion of Hungary, of Czechoslovakia, stan wojenny in Poland in 1980-81, and so on. So that actually Europe only moved towards this ambition of post-war after 1989. I will never forget the day after the Berlin Wall came down. I was walking down the street in East Berlin, and I met a very excited East Berliner who told me he'd just seen a poster, handwritten poster, which said, "Only today is the war really over." And there's a real sense in which that was true, in which for Central and Eastern Europe, the war only ended in 1989 to 1991. That was true objectively, geopolitically. The huge armies, conventional and nuclear, withdrew from the center of Europe. The peace settlement, which didn't happen after 1945 because the Cold War intervened, actually happened in 1990-91, right? So the Treaty on German Unification, the Paris Charter of Paris for a New Europe, the German-Polish Treaty, all of those treaties actually made the peace settlement. And we thought, but I emphasize we thought, that the last European empire, the Soviet-Russian Empire, had softly and suddenly vanished away in 3 years. And then what happened is that you had a generation of Europeans, many of them from the generation of 68, the 68ers, who believed that we could really have a Europe without walls and without wars. And they took the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, reduced military spending to well below 2% of GDP. They said security is no longer going to be about major interstate conflict, because there's not going to be another major war in Europe, is there? It's going to be collective security. We will Frieden schaffen ohne Waffen. You know that slogan, create peace without weapons. What really matters is economic policy. Globalization and economic independence will reinforce peace. So it's absolutely fine to become more dependent on for your energy on Russia, because that's good, because it's economic interdependence which will reinforce peace. And altogether, the notion was that we were moving towards Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace. And people forgot the Russian proverb which says, perpetual peace lasts until the next war. Now, if you ask why people in the West, in much of Europe, made this mistake, I think the most fundamental reason is what I would call a historiosophical mistake. That is to say, we took history, as we would say in English, with a small h, which is always about conjuncture, about opportunity, about chance, about individual choices, about leadership, goes this way and then goes that, and turned it into history with a capital H, as with Hegel, a Hegelian process of inevitable progress towards the spread of freedom and democracy. And we misread what happened between 1989 and 1991 and assumed that history was going to go on going that way. Whereas in fact, of course, what happened between 1989 and 1991 was a 1 in a million example of historical luck, right? 4 quite separate developments, none of them inevitable, converged. First of all, Mikhail Gorbachev, appointed on the 11th of March 1985. His competitor was a man called Grigory Romanov. Remember him? Good name for a Tsar. If Romanov had been appointed, it would be a very different story. The Central and East European oppositions, people like Václav Havel, Bronislaw Geremek, Adam Michnik, developed a strategy, the new evolutionism, social self-organization, so that when you got an yellow light, an amber light from Moscow, from Gorbachev, they turned it into a green light and drove through the traffic lights much further than Gorbachev imagined. Western Europe had a period of fantastic dynamism and attraction under Jacques Delors, the development of the single market. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to tell this joke in a Catholic university, but I'm going to tell it nonetheless. How many of you have seen the film When Harry Met Sally? Well, those of you who haven't seen it, please go and see it. Now, this is a film from 1989, and there's a famous moment in this film, one or two of you are smiling, in the diner, when the actress Meg Ryan, in conversation with her friend Harry, fakes the most enormous, sustained and loud orgasm. And it's the most extraordinary story. And then after this moment, a waitress approaches an elderly lady and says, "What would you like to eat, to order?" And the elderly lady said, "I'll have what she's having." And in a way, Eastern Europe in 1989 looked at Western Europe and said, "I'll have what she's having." And the final, fourth element was the US, which had been in the doldrums. It had been in a real mess in the 1970s. After the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, New York was nearly bankrupt. Everybody was very depressed. People were predicting the Soviet Union might even overtake the United States economically. But by the 1980s, under Ronald Reagan, it was a fantastically dynamic country again. Thanks to spending by the Defense Department, America was inventing the internet. The economy was doing brilliantly. Ronald Reagan convinced Americans, this was his slogan, "It's morning in America," right? And then you had this extraordinary individual, Ronald Reagan, who we all at the time dismissed as a B-movie actor, who in his first term was the ultimate Cold Warrior and tried to outarm the Soviet Union and actually persuaded the Soviet Union that it could not win the arms race. But then when Gorbachev comes along, he turned round and became the complete opposite and became the ultimate détente advocate, the ultimate disarmer. And that amazing term was crucial to the outcome of the Cold War. So these four separate developments, each of them with a remarkable individual at the core, all of which converged in this miraculous way to produce what Machiavelli called fortuna, historical luck. And then we turned it into the way history is inevitably going. Freedom is a struggle. You know this very well. We turned it into a process. Now, some of you at this point are going to say Francis Fukuyama and the end of history and liberal triumphalism in the early 1990s. Let me tell you, it wasn't then that the great mistake was made, because some of you in this room will still remember that period. I can assure you, we had no idea whether any of these transitions were going to work. The joke at the time in all the post-communist countries was, we know that you can turn an aquarium into fish soup, but can you turn fish soup back into an aquarium? I.e. a completely Sovietized society back into something like a free society. We didn't know if the transition to democracy would work. We didn't know if the transition to a market economy would work. We didn't know. And by the way, in Western Europe, most of the big projects that you now associate with the EU had still to be completed. We still had to complete the single market. Schengen didn't really come into operation until the mid-1990s. The Eurozone was just an idea at the beginning of the 1990s. And of course, the great eastward enlargement of the EU and NATO only happened in the early 2000s. So actually, and we had the wars in former Yugoslavia. 5 wars in former Yugoslavia. We'd said never again, and then it happened again. So actually, the 1990s were a period of struggle, of transition, of great uncertainty. And the problem really comes in the early to mid-2000s, when we begin to think mission accomplished. My friends in Poland and Hungary said they had consolidated democracies. We'd done the big enlargements of the EU and NATO. The euro seemed to be going very well, remember that. Britain seemed to be comfortable in Europe with Tony Blair, remember that. And to cap it all, we had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And actually, 2004-05 was the high point of our optimism, because you see, the Orange Revolution confirmed the Hegelian narrative that democracy and freedom are just inevitably spreading even further, and as so often, the turning point, downwards. Not for Ukraine, I'm not talking about Ukraine here, but in the wider European picture. So I talk about the upward turn in the history of Europe, which starts in 1985 and reaches a point of breakthrough in 1989. I would say that the downward turn in European history starts sometime around 2005. We had major terrorist attacks in Western Europe. France and the Netherlands voted down the constitutional treaty for the EU. Poland had its first Kaczynski government, the first populist nationalist government. Remember the twins, the terrible twins, the Kaczynskis. And then in 2007, Vladimir Putin declared war on the West at the Munich Security Conference. He made a keynote speech, and then the real, as it were, the downward equivalent of 1989, if you like, is 2008. The simultaneous emergence of the global financial crisis and of the annexation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And from 2008 onwards, it really is a case of crisis after crisis. I've mentioned the historiosophical mistake. There was also our own friend, hubris, which is a large part of it. The hubris of the United States, which thought that it was a hyperpower, the new Rome, a unipolar world, we can just march into Iraq and create a democracy. The hubris of cool Britannia, the hubris of believing the transition to democracy was complete, the hubris of the Eurozone, the hubris of an EU which believed that it was now a model for the whole world. Right? And the idea at that time was that we were an example of a postmodern, post-sovereign, post-national polity, which the rest of the world was going to kindly follow. Mark Leonard wrote a book entitled Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. He doesn't very much like being reminded of that book title now. The hubris of a globalized, financialized capitalism, which basically saw free markets as an almost an universal panacea, and believed that global aggregate gains could compensate, not just justify, but compensate for local losses. Populism, of course, told us that that wasn't the case. If you're someone in the north of England or the Rust Belt of the US, and you haven't got any richer or you've lost your job, it's no good for you if you're told that 300 million people in China have been lifted out of poverty. All those examples of hubris come together, and then we have blow after blow after blow. So the global financial crisis segues into the Eurozone crisis, and what is called the Great Recession. In 2010 already, Viktor Orban starts demolishing democracy in a Hungary which is now a full member state of the EU. For those of you who do European studies, that's not meant to be possible in the EU. The EU is meant to prevent that, but it was possible. Then, of course, as all of you know, 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. So war is coming back. 2015, Poland starts following the Hungarian example. 2015-16, you have the refugee crisis, so you now have a Europe which again has walls as well as war, because new walls start being built between Serbia and Hungary, between Poland and Lithuania and Belarus, and actually more to come. 2016, you have Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, which is a great blow to Europe, COVID pandemic, and then finally, in this story of a descent, of course, the 24th of February, 2022, a turning point in European history, and we now have the largest war in Europe since 1945, which has been carrying on for more than 9 months. Europe with a major war, and Europe with many new walls. Now, as well as the historiosophical mistake and our old friend hubris, I think there is one other aspect of this which is worth dwelling on, which is a failure to learn the lessons of history. Now, one lesson of history is we never know what's going to happen tomorrow. But another lesson of history is that it does help to have intelligent, historically informed guesswork about the probable way in which things may develop. Reinhard Koselleck, some of you will know, a fantastic, a great German intellectual historian, has a wonderful essay called The Unknown Future and the Art of Prognosis. And he makes a very simple point, that recurrent events or recurrent patterns are those which actually make it more possible to make probabilistic statements about the future. In other words, the more often something happens, the more likely you are to be able to build some prediction upon that pattern. So to give a rather obvious example, the prediction, we shall all die. In a vast historical data set, I don't know many examples to the contrary. So revolutions, wars, what happens to people who have too much power for too long, these are all recurrent patterns in history. So we can begin to make probabilistic statements. And one of those is what happens when imperial powers lose their empires. They don't like it. Let me let you into a secret. The Brits didn't like it. The French didn't like it. The Portuguese didn't like it. The Spanish didn't like it. Hence my story that I told you at the beginning, that we forget that for the first 30 years of the European Union, colonial powers were fighting wars to defend their empires. And then the oldest, largest land empire in Europe, the Russian Empire, softly and suddenly vanishes away in 3 years, 1989 to 1991, and we think, that's it, it's over, end of story. Huge mistake. I met Vladimir Putin in 1994 in St. Petersburg. It was a Western Russian conference, and Vladimir Putin was then the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. This rather unpleasant-looking, slightly rat-faced little man sitting at the end of the conference table. Nobody took any notice of him. He didn't speak for 2 days because all the important people were speaking. And then right at the end, I was half asleep, but I woke up at this point. This man spoke up, and he said, I just want to remind you that there are territories that have always been Russian, always, which are now outside the Russian Federation, and we have a responsibility towards them. And he explicitly mentioned Crimea. And he said there are 25 million Russians outside the Russian Federation, and we have a duty to protect them. 1994. Don't tell me Russia's behavior today is a result of the enlargement of NATO, which happened 5 years later. So the revanchist imperial instinct, the instinct to strike back, was there way back in 1994. So if we had learnt that lesson of history, colonial powers don't like losing their empires, they try and get them back, we would have recognized the pattern. Already Transnistria, obviously. Then South Ossetia and Abkhazia, alarm signals going. But at the very latest, 2014. And my argument would be that 2014 is the turning point at which the West failed to turn. That was the point at which we should have understood the threat that was coming from a neo-imperialist Russia, reduced our energy independence, increased our military capability, and had a much, much stronger line in terms of sanctions and diplomacy towards Russia. Instead of which, most of Western Europe did the opposite. In particular, Germany reduced its military so that it now actually doesn't have the staff because it was so underfunded, and increased its energy dependence from Russia. Nord Stream 2, let me remind you, was entirely negotiated and built after 2014. So a failure to learn the lessons of history is something for which we ought to be more precise. You are paying the price. And it's been very moving for me coming here, because of course one knows it from television and reports and so on, but I've been in and out of the Church of St. Peter and Paul, where almost every day there's a military funeral. This morning I saw another military funeral. Yaroslav Fitzak was telling me about the funeral of Artemid Yemid, and I then went online and looked at the video, which is unbearably moving. So you more than anyone know the cost that is being paid. Never again, we said, but in this war we have gone all the way back. And I don't need to remind you that this war is being fought on the very territory where Nazi Germany's Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS fought a war of terror 80 years ago. The same towns, the same villages, sometimes the very same people. Boris Romanchenko survived 4 Nazi concentration camps, killed by a Russian missile in Kharkiv, the Russian missile landing near Babin Yar. So if our first commandment after 1945 was never again post-war, we have to bow our heads in shame. I would argue, and here I'm coming towards the end of the historical part of my lecture, and then I'm going to move on to contemporary developments. I would argue and this is in a sense the last chapter of my book, that this war marks the end both of what I call the post-wall period, i.e. the period after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and in some sense of the post-war period. Of the post-wall period, because as I've described to you, the post-war period was a period of illusions, or if you want to put it more kindly, hopes, of a genuinely post-war Europe without war and walls. And here we are again. But also, and by the way, a Europe that is now waking up to the fact that it has to have what Olaf Scholz called a Zeitenwende. But also because it seems to me, and this won't be news to you, that in a sense, a circle is closed between 1991 and 2022. Because after all, what is happening today is what the putschists in Moscow wanted to do in August 1991, right? And what is more, General Sergei Surovikin, now the commander of the Russian armed forces in this country, the butcher of Aleppo, was a putschist in August 1991. He was one of those guys back then who wanted to restore the Russian Empire. And Yevgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group celebrated his arrival on Telegram with these words, I quote from the translation: Surovikin didn't have time to get all of his ammunition into his tank in August 1991. If he had, we'd be living in a totally different country, one 10 times more powerful. End of the post-war period and its illusions. The post-war period is a little bit more complicated, because if you look at the political map of Europe, the state system in Europe, then the post-war period did actually end in 1990-91. I mean, that's when we got the new political map of Europe, which, with a few exceptions, because of obviously new states in former Yugoslavia, is still the map we have today. If you think about the international institutions that still matter to us, NATO, the EU, the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, most of these date from the immediate post-war period. So in that sense, we're still living in the post-war period. But if you take Tony Judd's second sense of the Europe that has genuinely got itself to a state beyond war, then clearly that is no longer the case. And the most telling symptom of this is that Germany, the country which went furthest in, so to speak, trying to imagine a future without military power, is now proclaiming the Zeitenwende. And if Germany does in fact spend 2% of its GDP on defense, it will have the third largest defense budget in the world, not just in Europe. It'll be US, China, and then $75 billion German defense budget. And I don't need to tell you that a Germany that takes military power seriously again is a major factor in European history. So something new has begun, but we don't know what it is. We are entering a new era whose character we don't know, and which does not yet have a name. The post-war, the post-post-wall, the post-post-Cold War era. People struggle, but it's too soon. And at that point, really the historian should put down his microphone. There's the history. But since I'm here in Ukraine, let me say a few things to open up the discussion about where we are at the moment and that uncertain future of which Reinhard Koselleck spoke. First of all, there are some although not majority voices in the West, calling for peace negotiations with Russia. Peace negotiations with Russia at this moment would be the worst possible way to get to peace. This is absolutely clear to me, because Putin would like nothing more than to have a ceasefire, reinforce his troops, dig in, retrain, replenish his ammunition, and then start again. The shortest and best path to peace is for Ukraine to win this war. And I wrote that in a Guardian column a couple of weeks ago, and I'm absolutely persuaded that it's so, and I'm not sure I have to convince you of that. And the message I've got loud and clear here in Lviv is weapons, weapons, weapons. I mean, literally everybody I've spoken to has said just that. But I want to share with you the fear that many leading military analysts, including senior people in NATO and the military, have. And that fear is that this could be a long war. And let me put the analysis to you very simply. The analysis is, you're not going to give up. You're going to go on fighting. And you're going to have the Western military-industrial complex more or less behind you. We can talk about the more or less, but you're going to have it behind you. Putin is not going to give up. He said as much again yesterday, I think, in front of an institution called with black humor a Russian human rights conference. He said the war could be a long process, but that he was already doing well because Russia had got more territory, and he said even Peter I never controlled the Sea of Azov. So let's not kid ourselves. There's a lot of reporting about how badly the war is going for Russia, but he's still thinking, I can win, and particularly win in the long run. So what could change? Obviously, war is very uncertain. Nobody knows how it's going to turn out. But I think for a decisive outcome, one of two things would have to happen. And forgive me for giving this analysis very straight. One is the West gives up. The other is that there's political change in Russia. I mean, that's where you finally get to a lasting peace. So you're going to ask me, is the West going to give up? No, but with one caveat. So obviously you all know there are lots of voices in Germany and Italy and France and Spain and elsewhere calling for peace. That's and some pro-Russian voices. But they do not prevail. Public opinion in many countries, including Germany, is way ahead of the government. You have leaders all over Europe and in the United States who are committed to supporting Ukraine. It's become part of their own credibility. You have the media very much on the Ukrainian side, because you have a whole generation of journalists for whom this has been an absolutely, some very brave journalists, by the way, for whom this has been a formative experience. And anyway, the major military support comes from a handful of countries, right? It's not NATO as NATO. It's the US, it's Poland, it's the Baltic states, and I'm very proud to say it's my own country, Britain. And I have to tell you, in the 6 years since Brexit, there hasn't been much one could be proud of in the behavior of British governments. But this is something one can really be very proud of, and I am. And by the way, it's not just Boris. Dzień dobry, everybody. It's right across all parties. You know, we had so many prime ministers, I've almost lost count. But all of them thought one of the first things they should do is come to Kiev. So Liz Truss, who only lasted about 5 minutes, but within those 5 minutes, she came to Kiev. And Rishi Sunak, for whom Eastern Europe could not be more remote, But he too thought the most important thing was to come to Kiev. So there's really strong support there. There's fantastically strong support in Poland. Posthumous bow to Jerzy Giedroyc and Miraszewski. The question mark is the United States. The one circumstance in which I would really be worried about the West, in a sense giving up, i.e. suddenly pushing Ukraine to make whatever deal they could, is if Donald Trump were elected in 2024. If the war has gone on for 2 more years and this terrible, unreliable, narcissistic populist who's often spoken admiringly about Vladimir Putin became the president in a country which was going through a tough economic period where a lot of voters were saying, why the hell have we spent $150 billion, as it would be by then, on Ukraine? That is the one circumstance where I would be worried, which is why you should all be very pleased about the results of the midterm elections, and most recently the Georgia result, because that's a defeat for Donald Trump. So I think the West is going to hold solid. What does that leave us with? That leaves us with what I believe is ultimately the key, which is that you will be so successful on the battlefield, you will be recovering territory, there will be more losses for Russia, the sanctions will begin to bite more effectively, and at some point there will be political change in Russia. Now, you may then ask, but how? We can all speculate. We can all have great fun speculating over a glass of wine or vodka or whatever. The truth is, nobody knows. Churchill famously said that Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. We just don't know. In a tyranny, in a personalist dictatorship like that, we just don't know what to give. It's probably something to do with the elites more than with public opinion, but who knows? But what I'm persuaded of is that we have to have a policy which enables you to hold on, to continue to have victories, not to freeze in the winter, not to have your economy collapse, until the point where change comes in Russia, which I think will be the key to a lasting peace. That's a pretty tough prospect, but I think that is where we are. In other words, before 2022, the West had a Russia policy, but not a Ukraine policy. Now the West has a Ukraine policy, but not a Russia policy. But my argument is, our Ukraine policy is our Russia policy. That is to say, what is actually going to affect change in Russia is what we succeeded in doing with you in Ukraine. One day the war will end, then we will again be in a post-war Europe with a new name. And let me finally just say a few words about the subject of the conference today before opening it up for questions and discussion, which is about the larger framework in which I would like to see a post-war free and sovereign Ukraine. I think we have, for the first time ever in European history, the opportunity to have a genuinely post-imperial Europe. That is to say, a Europe which for the first time ever, and I mean in the perspective of thousands of years, neither has empires overseas nor empires on our own continent. The last one is the Russian one. When that is finished, we have a possibility of a genuinely post-imperial Europe, and the key to that is the enlargement of the key institutions of the Euro-Atlantic West, which are, of course, the EU and NATO. Starting with EU enlargement, where the 24th of February is an absolute turning point. So after the Orange Revolution, I went off to Brussels and talked to the then President of the European Commission, José Manuel Barroso, and I said to him, why don't you say that in principle we wish Ukraine to be a future member of the EU. And he said, I can't say that because I would be immediately slapped down by 2 major member states. Anyone like to guess which they were? Brilliant, you all know, fantastic, of course, France and Germany. And that was the French and German position from the aftermath of the Orange Revolution all the way to the 23rd of February this year. I spoke to a senior advisor to Olaf Scholz, who shall be nameless, at the Munich Security Conference, which ended just 5 days before the 24th of February. And he said to me in terms, because I was pushing for this EU enlargement perspective, and he said, Olaf Scholz, Olaf's position is clear. EU enlargement, Western Balkans, and no further. 4 months later, there was Olaf Scholz with Emmanuel Macron, Mario Draghi, and the president of Romania in Kiev saying, we welcome you as a candidate. We support you as a candidate for the EU. Quite a turn. 6 months later, there was Olaf Scholz at the Charles University in Prague, actually spelling out a vision. I don't know, have any of you seen that speech? Please have a look at it, because I know people are very critical of Germany here with very good reason, and specifically of Olaf Scholz. We can talk about that maybe in the discussion. But when it comes to setting out a peacetime vision for reconstruction and EU enlargement, he's not doing a bad job. And it really lays out what it would take. And he says explicitly once again, we want the EU to enlarge to include both the Western Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia. Amazing statement for a German chancellor to make, or a French president. And then he goes on to spell out what that would involve, what concrete steps have to be taken for such a large new eastward enlargement. And the deepening of the European Union that would be needed to make an EU of 35 member states work, right? Because as you guys know, at the moment, a lot of it is done by unanimity. So that great Democrat and friend of Mr. Putin, Viktor Orban, is constantly vetoing things, including sanctions resolutions on Russia, or by the way, also vetoing things that would adversely affect China. It's not going to work if you have an EU of 35 and still any individual head of government can veto such important things. So there is actually a vision there for what EU enlargement would involve. And by the way, EU enlargement basically has stalled since 2007. North Macedonia was promised, became a candidate for EU membership in 2005. What are we now? 17 years later, 18 years later, it's still no further. That's a nightmare. So what we need is a strategy that combines what I'm going to call the 3 R's for Ukraine: reconstruction, reform, and rolling forward. It thinks together those 3 big chunks of things. The enormous project that you'll need for reconstruction, probably $400 billion and counting. The reforms which are clearly going to be necessary. And a process whereby you're not stuck like North Macedonia for 17 years, while you have to fill in an enormous long shopping list of every single element of the acquis communautaire. And then at the end of 20 years, maybe you're graciously allowed, into the front hall. But a process where there are staging points along the way. So that, for example, there's a partial membership of the single market. My friends in Brussels tell me it's entirely possible that you could even have full membership of the single market at a certain point, 5-7 years down the road. So that you do this, the EU does that. You do that, the EU does that. And there's a process with staging points along the way, so you're actually getting something from it. And at the same time, the EU is actually reforming itself. For example, having more qualified majority voting so that the thing actually works. If we realize this vision, and this is a vision for 10, 20 years ahead, but so was the vision for uniting Europe when I started out in the 1970s, so was the vision for Europe whole and free in the early 1990s. If we realize this vision, then we will be closer than ever before to a Europe whole and free. We will be closer than ever before to the situation where cultural and historical Europe, to which, of course, Ukraine belongs, most of cultural and historical Europe is in one and the same economic, political, and security community. That's never happened in European history, ever. And it's a big challenge whether we can make it work. You know, the Holy Roman Empire was a hell of a lot smaller than this, and that was quite complicated. So making a European Union of 35 member states work, this, what I call the enlargement of the West, also involves bringing Ukraine into NATO. That seems to me absolutely clear, that the only true security guarantee against a revanchist Russia is going to be NATO membership for Ukraine. But it's not on the cards at the moment. And so just like the EU, where you have to have a series of staging points on the way there, what we're going to have to think about is a series of staging points on the way to an eventual NATO membership, but being clear in your minds and our minds that that's where we want to go. So it's, I think, Heraclitus said, war is the father of all things. So war is the father of this tragedy you're experiencing at the moment, but war is also the father of an extraordinary historical opportunity, which wasn't there before the 24th of February, let's be clear. But it's a daunting prospect. It's going to take decades. It's going to take an extraordinary amount of work and courage and ingenuity on your part and on our part. So let me finish, if I may, before going into the discussion, by sharing with you a quotation from one of the greatest Europeans of our time, Václav Havel, who made a distinction between hope and optimism. And it goes like this, I quote, "Hope is not prognostication. It's an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. Hope is an ability to work for something because it's good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. Defending, improving, and extending a free Europe, including a free Ukraine, makes sense. It's a cause worthy of hope." Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Professor Timoty Ґартона, thank you. Thank you. Just a minute, okay? Just a minute. Just let me thank you, Professor Timoty Ґартона Esh. And as I said, this is the man who could make sense of nonsense. You see this, you hear the sense of the very last sentence of this lecture. So we have a Q&A section nowadays. So what I'm saying here, ви можете також задавати питання по-українськи, я або хтось буде перекладати. Мирослава, go ahead, please. Мікрофон.
So you mentioned hope and optimism. I would like to say that it's good to be optimist, but it's important to be realist. So my question would be about integration, NATO and EU, and in EU reform. Right now, every country in EU has why it's veto power, why everybody has the voice, because every nation has the same amount of level in decision making. And there are proposals to change that to majority, and that means that some of the countries would lose that ability to have that whole voice in the decision making. And that scares a lot of smaller countries, not like Germany and France, but Poland, for example. They are afraid that some bigger power in Europe would have more effect on decision making. That's the first thing. How do you see this reform working out? Second, the issue of agricultural abilities of the countries in EU and Ukraine as a powerhouse in future Europe. And that scares a lot, again, France, for example. So how do you see this all things working out? And second question about, third question about, it's all in the same topic, time. Okay, third, NATO or EU, what should be first? And what is easier for Ukraine, NATO or EU? Thank you.
This was an exception. Let's limit everyone for one question only, okay?
Thank you very much for your question, singular. Three parts, I'll answer them in reverse order, because the answer to your third prong is very simple. EU first, no question. EU is much easier. CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, of course, the French and other big agricultural countries would hate the idea that all the CAP subsidies went from them and came to Ukraine, so it's not going to happen. And it's simply not going to happen. It's going to be another deal. As for what's called QMV, qualified majority voting, of course, as you know, there are various areas of EU policy where you already have that, right? So trade policy, for example, regulatory policy. And the proposal is simply step by step to extend the areas in which you have qualified majority voting, right? Approaching the most sensitive ones. What then happens in these areas is not that little countries have no influence. Little countries get together with medium-sized countries and big countries to make a lobby for a particular approach and to get that majority, right? So that's how it would work. France, of course, and Spain and Portugal are not happy about what Olaf Scholz described as the center of Europe moving eastwards, right? He misquoted Karl Schlegel. The center of Europe is moving eastwards. But you have an immensely powerful lobby in all the Central and East European countries who are now almost a majority of EU member states, number one. And therefore, the key swing state is Germany, which is why, if I may say so, even though I totally understand the criticism of Germany for being so slow and so reluctant in weapons deliveries and always wanting to keep talking to Putin, just bear in mind that Germany is the key to EU enlargement, and you've got to have Germany on your side if you're going to get those coalitions together that will make it happen.
Sir, thank you very much for your overarching vision. My question will be related to the future of Russia, and specifically to one of the scenarios when Russia collapses. My friends in Kenya are not very happy having Somalia next to them. Same are the Uganda friends having DRC next door. How do you see possible de-imperialization of Russia being given a real lack of possible elites and the outcomes of it for Ukraine and Europe? Thank you.
It's very interesting to me because I've heard this scenario more often in 4 days in Ukraine than I've heard it in 9 months, in the rest of Europe. I actually don't think it's very likely. I don't think the disintegration scenario is. I think what's most likely is some sort of elite move against Putin or around Putin, or the least unlikely. But the larger question is indeed the decolonization or the self-decolonization of Russia. How does it cease to be an empire? And this is a huge problem because, this a dangerous generalization to make in the presence of distinguished historians like Professor Herzog, but essentially Russia hasn't been anything except an empire in modern history, right? So if you take the Brits, we were terrible, horrible imperialists, but when we lost our empire, number one, it was overseas, so there's a clear geographical dividing line between what was empire and what wasn't, and number two, already in the 15th century, we had a monarchy, a parliament, a privy council, a civil service, independent courts, and clear frontiers. So there was a well-defined nation-state to go back to. And that seems to me the deepest problem with the de-imperialization of Russia, that there isn't a historical Russia to reach back to. So it's just going to be more difficult for them to get to. Against that, I would say, hence my argument that our Ukraine policy is our Russian policy, that if we succeed in realizing the vision of Europe, which I've been suggesting to you, and you have a prosperous, sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Western Balkans, and Baltic states, believe you me, young Russians will look at that and they will say, I'll have what she's having. So I think that I'm a short-term pessimist about Russia, but a long-term optimist.
Professor Esch, thank you very much. And my question kind of overlaps or maybe continues the previous question. What you believe is the current strategy of the EU towards Russia? Because one thing is it's a huge nuclear, power, and if it goes uncontrolled, who knows what may happen. Another thing is, the weaker Russia is, the stronger China is. And there are many talks about, the less control or capability to control different territories the central kind of government, Russian government has, the more access China has to huge resources in far east of Russia. So again, is it something that is negotiated, and what are those strategies that are on the table now? Thank you.
In an odd way, that's an easy question to answer because there are none. It doesn't exist. I mean, in as much as there was a European strategy towards Russia, it was blown out of the water on the 24th of February, right? So, I mean, by the way, just en passant, because it connects to the last question, I actually don't think that European Russians in Moscow or St. Petersburg, are going to be happy with the prospect of just being a junior partner of China, of being a satrap of China. So I have heard it, Fyodor Lukyanov, for example, a Russian thinker some of you will know, articulates a future in which Russia still culturally looks to the West and Europe, but geopolitically to Asia, and a partnership with China. I personally doubt very much if that's a long-term strategy for Russia, so I'm very doubtful about that. As for EU strategy, it doesn't exist. What does exist is different arguments in different European countries about how we should approach Russia longer term, with Macron in particular and the Germans saying we've still got to have a Russia policy and we've still got to think about Russia as a great power and a future partner and so on and so forth. And many others say forget it until Putin leaves the Kremlin. And I'm a forget it until Putin leaves the Kremlin person. I think we have to think about a long-term strategy with Russia when we have a clearer sense of what's coming after Putin.
Thank you for the lecture. I actually have a lot of questions, but I'll limit myself to just two. Sorry? Yeah.
You've got to learn. What you have to do is to pretend you have one question and then ask three. That's
right. So one thing I want to ask is, so imagine there's a war ended by military means. and then Russia is really humiliated, not just Putin, but Russia. Just think about taking back Crimea, that is treasured not only by Putin, but by most Russians. Then all of those puppet states like Transnistria probably fall out also. And that's a huge step back even in the self-perception. So, and then there's a huge risk probably of the emergence of some kind of revenge moods in the Russian population, especially among those who are intentionally pro-war. And so, and then no one is going to intervene Russia to end it like it was with the Nazi state in the Second World War. How do we manage that? Yeah, okay, I'll limit myself to one then.
Well, it's a very big question, so it'll count to three. I mean, we already have a revanchist Russia, right? So it's not as if we're waiting to see if we get one. I mean, a couple of points. Number one, we're all speculating here. The impact of a clear defeat does not always lead you towards Weimar Germany and then Nazi Germany, towards a revanchist. In the case of the Falklands War, for example, it actually resulted in the fall of the dictator. In the case of Milosevic in Serbia, again, it resulted in the fall of Milosevic and a transition to some sort of a democracy. So it's not, that pattern from history is not so absolutely clear. Of course, the best solution would clearly be that Russia would be totally defeated and could start again like West Germany after 1945. And if people talk about any prospect long-term of reconciliation between Ukraine and Russia, of course the precondition for reconciliation is that Russia says sorry, acknowledges what has happened, pays reparations. Germany did that, but before Germany did that, it was defeated and occupied, right? So you have a whole sequence which it is impossible to follow. Why? Because Russia has nuclear weapons. So it does raise for the historian the question, what would have happened in 1945 if instead of the Americans getting the atomic bomb, Germany had done? So it's a very sobering question. So that the danger is certainly there. Therefore, we need a very strong policy of containment for Russia. We also will need to engage with a post-Putin Russia, actively engage. And one other thing I would say, and some of you may disagree with this, because of the sort of outrage against the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, there have been calls for us to cut off all our cultural ties with Russia and all our academic ties with Russia. I have a project which has the Higher School of Economics in Moscow as one of the partners. We have kept those contacts. We've kept those contacts because I don't think I should punish ordinary Russian students for Putin's war, which they have nothing to do with and don't support. And anyway, it wouldn't be wise of us just to cut them off completely, because if you cut them off completely, they will feel they are being punished for Putin's war, and that will create a solidarity effect with the nationalist regime in Russia. So I think we have to think smart about the kind of behavioral psychology of Russian society after what I hope will be a painful defeat.
Thank you. Yes, I have only one question. I hope it's not going to be very long. The first part of the question you have already answered. It's about whether Russia will be able to establish democracy sometime. Yeah, so like, will it be possible to establish this end of the history in Fukuyama's way, at least on European continent? But I wanted to question a little further about global Ukrainian place, not only in Europe, but in whole world. Will Ukraine be able, for example, to become some kind of like symbolic bridge between this West and East, if this distinction is still actual? or after Russia will become democratic country, it will like take this title and proceed as it did before?
Just on your Fukuyama point, we're definitely not at the end of history in Fukuyama's sense. There's a wonderful book which some of you may know by a historian called Mark Mazoa. Does anyone know that? Called Dark Continent. It's a terrific history of 20th century Europe. And his argument is that for most of the short 20th century, between 1914 and 1989, there was a contest in Europe between fascism, communism, and liberal democracy. And for a lot of that period, it wasn't clear who was going to win, right? I would say we now have, again, a version of that competition, because I would argue that Russia is a fascist state. We are liberal democracies. And you know, if you listen to Xi Jinping, it's a kind of communist country. It's certainly a Leninist country, maybe a Leninist capitalist country. So actually, once again, we have a major kind of systemic competition out there. And I'm not going to sit here like Fukuyama and say liberal democracy is bound to win. Okay, to the second part of your question, I believe the bridging power of the future should be the European Union. We're going into a post-Western, post-European world, right? For centuries, Europe was calling the shots. Then the United States was calling the shots, so you had Western ascendancy. The period of Western ascendancy has come to the end. If you're in Africa or Latin America, China is your top trading partner. China is just as powerful or more so than the United States or Europe. So in this world of non-Western giants, China, potentially India, Brazil, South Africa, we in Europe have to be a giant ourselves. And Germany is not big enough to be that giant. France is not big enough. Britain is not big enough. Nor is Ukraine big enough. So that power that you're evoking has to be the European Union.
Final two questions, or probably 2.5.
Thank you for the lecture. And the question, you mentioned a lot the previous post-war period. And you as a historian, maybe you can have a take on what are the most important skills or competences for the post-war period, maybe some lessons from the past, and your advice, top skills or competences for war and post-war society in Ukraine.
That is a terrific question. So first of all, I would say don't call it a Marshall Plan, because the history of the last 70 years is littered with the remains of failed Marshall Plans. Every few years people say, let's have a Marshall Plan for this or that. And the Marshall Plan was a US initiative. Let's call it a Zelensky Plan, or a Europe Plan, or a new Europe Plan, because this is going to be about the whole of Europe coming through. Europe is going to be the key to economic recovery. So in that sense, it's quite different from the post-45 period when Europe was in ruins, down and out, and it had to be the United States. That's point number one. Point number two, you need statecraft. You need really good leaders. We were very lucky in the post-war period because we had a whole group of leaders, Marshall himself, Truman, Adenauer, de Gaulle, de Gasperi, Winston Churchill, all of whom emerged from the war with this experience and this vision of how to build it. Point number three, don't make the mistakes of the 1990s, right? Don't think that the free market is the answer to anything. Don't think that liberalism is just about economics. Don't think it's the economy, stupid. Understand that society and culture are just, and politics of course, are just as important to building a free society as the economy. And so when you're thinking about reconstruction and reform and the approach to the EU, keep in mind the social dimension, the cultural dimension, the political dimension, and don't just leave it down to the economy.
And the final question is there any lady here? Okay, there's a lady there. I would prefer, I'm sorry, make a gender balance.
Thank you. And my question will be, first of all, we criticized France and Germany today a lot. And my question is about another one country, or a European country, that is difficult to work with nowadays, about Hungary. And what is the role of Hungary nowadays, and as a European country, and how to work with it for Ukraine and for other European countries?
So I first met Viktor Orban in 1988. Young student in Budapest, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, liberal, we're going to build a wonderful new democracy. And then he came to study with us in Oxford, and I've never forgotten him standing in my study saying, we're going to build a great liberal democracy. And we identified him as one of the most promising young politicians of the post-communist period. And in that, we were not wrong. It's just that he used his skills in completely the wrong directions. He used his skills to demolish democracy rather than building democracy. So it's a huge disappointment. Number one, that he did it. Number two, that he could bring the Hungarians along for it. And number three, that the EU not only allowed it to happen, but paid for it. Because the key to his success in Hungary, one of the keys, has been EU membership, single market, German industry comes and invests, car industry, and billions of euros of EU money, which have actually supported his regime. He uses them for patronage. He uses them to prey off friendly media owners. He uses them to buy votes. So it's a really shocking story, and I think that what really needs doing is for the EU to get serious about its own basic values expressed in Article 2 of its treaty, and to make an effective linkage between the Europe of money and the Europe of values, which it's simply failing to do. And there's not a great deal that Ukraine can do about it, because this guy is not only demolishing democracy, he's also Putin's friend inside the EU, as you know, vetoing sanctions and making his own deals for Russian gas and blocking the gas price limit and so on and so forth. What Ukraine can do is go on calling him out. So some people remember Zelensky's appearance, one of his many appearances, when he said, have a few of you been to Budapest? So do you know that, yeah, quite a few of you have, so do you know that very moving monument on the side of the bank of the Danube, where you have these metal shoes commemorating the Jews who were shot and pushed into the water? And do you remember Zelensky called out Hungary on that, and he said, I've been and I've seen that monument, and this is what is happening again. That was a great moment. And so I would say also you as young Ukrainians, because you also have voices, if you're talking to media or if you have any contacts, keep calling him out on this, because it really is a scandal, and this is not the Europe we want.
Thank you. So what would be a final question without the really final question? And it belongs to me.
So you're standing between us and the buffet.
My question is, when we experience such a tremendous shifts, change, all the kind of thing, why shouldn't we just drop the post-imperial, post-war, whatever, just think about new reality?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great idea, but then the question is, what is the positive description we're going to give to this? And let me suggest two. One is the one that already exists, which is Europe whole, free, and at peace. And the irony is, this famous formulation was not made by a European. It was George H.W. Bush, but actually the guy who wrote it, this is the cruelty of history, is someone who nobody's ever heard of. He's a guy called Harvey Sitcherman, who was an obscure diplomat in the US State Department, but he actually wrote this wonderful phrase. And for me, that is the best description of the Europe I personally have been working for all my adult life, Europe whole, free and at peace. If you want one other, how about a commonwealth, which is also the English term for the Rzeczpospolita Polska-Litewska, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. People don't like, we talked about this the other night, people don't like the idea of Europe being an empire, although you could argue that in some ways it is an empire like the Holy Roman Empire. But how about a European Commonwealth? Shall we have a vote on that? Who would vote for a European Commonwealth? Put your hands up. Well, I don't think we have an overwhelming majority here. Right, we'll have to keep working at it.
So then you have to come again in a few times, so we'll check in again.
It's a promise.
So I believe you all applause for Professor Timoty Ґартона. Thank you so much. Thank you.